guess I agree with you.
I want to know already. Daniel, show me yours.
All right.
What are your takes on fighters and the current zeitgeist of the UFC?
So I'm going to be talking about um, fight strategy. So in MMA, there are three main aspects to fighting. You have striking, you have takedowns, and you have ground fighting. Striking arts include boxing, Muay Thai, Taekwondo, karate, etc. Takedown arts include wrestling, judo, sambo, etc. And arts that specialize in the ground include BJJ, catch wrestling, judo, etc., as well as ground and pound. I argue that in order to be good at MMA, you need to be good at two of the three aspects. Here's why. Consider a world champion kickboxer in his first MMA fight. He has amazing hands and feet, but in the first 5 seconds of the match, his opponent, who is a BJJ black belt, double legs him and puts him on his back. He is absolutely clueless about what to do there, and as he can't really punch or kick his opponent. So in panic, he gives up his back, to which the BJJ black belt happily takes and chokes him out. This is exactly how the first UFC fight played out. At the time, no one knew the ground game nearly as well as the Gracie family. And so once Royce Gracie managed to secure a takedown, it was a guaranteed victory. Nowadays, this barely happens because everyone understands that as a striker, you won't survive a round without either a strong ground game or a strong takedown defense game. Conor McGregor, Israel Adesanya, Francis Ngannou, they're all amazing strikers with amazing takedown defense. They control where the fight goes so that they can fully use their striking. Now let's go through all the combinations and see why each of them work. There's striker plus takedown defense, striker plus ground game, takedowns plus ground game. Well, to make this simpler, I'll just call takedowns and takedown defense wrestling and ground game as BJJ. So the reason striker and wrestling works is that you can keep the fight standing where you are superior. Striking plus BJJ works because you'll be able to survive on the feet or the ground regardless where the fight goes. Wrestling and BJJ works because you can force the fight to the ground where you are superior. But something very interesting happens when you pit them against each other. Let's consider striking and wrestling versus BJJ and wrestling. What usually happens here is the fight ends up as a wrestling match, where the ground fighter constantly shoots for the takedown, while the striker desperately scrambles to keep themselves on the. Now the striker and wrestling versus striker and BJJ. Here the fight will likely be contested on the feet, since they are both comfortable on the feet, but the one who is good at BJJ doesn't have the means to take down his opponent. And finally, striker plus BJJ versus ground fighter versus wrestling. This will likely be contested on the ground, since the BJJ wrestler will be able to take the striker down, where they will be evenly matched. As you might have noticed, we have shown that the fight will likely be contested in the aspect of fighting that both fighters have in common. With this, you can reliably predict where the fight will happen. But it's less clear how fights between fighters with similar combinations will play out, since they're evenly matched standing or on the ground, and so they won't really have a preference. But I'd bet on the fight being mainly standing, just because the fight starts standing. So, Anirudh, do you agree with this theory or not?
I'm not gonna lie. I feel like a lot of this is bullshit. Uh, here's the way that I see it. Right, there's some fighters that you just can't put them into categories like this. Is Kamaru Usman a wrestler?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean,
is Kamaru Usman a wrestler, a striker, jiu-jitsu master? What is he?
Heuristics.
Yeah, these are heuristics, but what use are these heuristics?
I mean, so you can get. I mean, let's just go for like Damian Maia versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. You have Damian Maia who has good BJJ and decent, I guess, okay wrestling, and then Stephen Wonderboy Thompson who's an amazing striker and has pretty good takedown defense. It's a pretty smart bet to make that the whole fight will be Damian Maia trying to take him down and Wonderboy stopping the takedowns, right? And same thing with like probably Usman and Wonderboy Thompson.
Okay, so this is where I'm going to push back because here's the thing about MMA: your wrestling makes your striking more dangerous.
Okay.
Let's go back to Michael Chandler versus Dan Hooker. That was earlier this year. First main card of the year, first co-main event of the year. Dan Hooker is on paper the way better striker, right? I think we both agreed that going into the fight, he had the reach advantage, he had the height advantage. Michael Chandler was a better wrestler, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why Michael Chandler knocked the fuck out of Dan Hooker is because Michael Chandler kept going for the single leg, or going for the double leg, going for the takedown, and used that to mix it up, mix martial arts, and knock Dan Hooker out. It seems that using one as trickery for the other is a very useful tool. There are so many fighters who are great at one thing and then they completely change up their style. Brian Ortega was like what you would classify back then: great striker, and great jiu-jitsu guy, terrible wrestling. He came out and he out wrestled the Korean Zombie, who was a very good grappler in his own right, completely. And that was because he completely changed his style. Did his other aspects deteriorate? Probably not by much. It seems as though this is a little too pigeonholey. There are too many restrictions on this, and it's like a gross oversimplification of game. You couldn't even say something like this about jiu-jitsu. It's just one sport, but there's so many factors that go into people's their leverages, their history, their lineage. There's the history of teaching, all the techniques that they've learned, injuries that they had. There's so much more that goes to fighters. Like Yoel Romero is an amazing wrestler. He didn't attempt even attempted one takedown against Israel Adesanya. He didn't care about it.
Here's the thing. He doesn't know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, at all. I actually watched a fight between him and
Wait, but he doesn't need that. If he just takes Israel as
that's the point.
No, he doesn't. Wait, just because the takedown happens,
okay, he has his ground and
submission.
Pound,
Wait, ground and pound is quite literally how wrestlers first started doing well in the UFC. All the wrestlers in the early 2000s, all they did is just take people down, hold them down, and beat the shit out of them. They didn't need any jiu-jitsu.
But if they had jiu-jitsu,
they were ground and pounding jiu-jitsu black belts like it was nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need jiu-jitsu when you get to the ground. You might need some jiu-jitsu to learn how to defend against submissions, but if you can punch people in the face, just punch people in the face.
I get your point that, okay, there's nuances, obviously, and also like people are have varying degrees of striking and wrestling and BJJ. It's not like there's actually like a striker and a wrestler and no BJJ. Like everyone probably at least has a blue belt level in BJJ, right? Even if you're Israel Adesanya or Conor McGregor, like all of them
or Derek Lewis.
Yeah, Derek Lewis.
Wait, Derek Lewis blows everything out of the water. His solution to everything is just land one punch. If you try to take him down, he just stands up. If you try to submit him, he just stands up.
Mm-hmm.
If you take his back, he's just going to shake you off like a wet dog. Okay. This doesn't... I feel like this is great in theory, but this is great from the perspective of a person who's never fought.
I think it actually maps onto reality pretty well. So, for example, Israel Adesanya, you would consider him a striker with takedown defense, pretty much. Like he never goes for submissions, or like rarely.
He doesn't go for submissions because he doesn't need to.
Yeah, I know. That's not the point, though. The point is he doesn't need to because he's a striker and he wants to knock people out. But if he goes against a wrestler or, a ground fighter, you can easily expect the whole fight to be the ground fighter trying to take him down. So there's plenty of examples of this. What else? Let me think.
I feel like Israel Adesanya is one archetype, but his style is very rare. This whole specialist mantra, there's Israel Adesanya, there's Conor McGregor, there's Khabib. There's only one specialist. I think that is... It doesn't map onto most fighters. There are 500 fighters fighting for the UFC. I think this model might be successful for maybe 10. You can understand maybe 10 of them with this. This doesn't explain Kamaru Usman. It really doesn't.
Well, I think it used to explain him. And then now he got better at striking. And now he's pretty evenly matched with everyone.
Wait, so if he's all three,
mm-hmm.
then this model doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said it's less clear as to how fights between fighters with similar combinations will play out.
Well, it's not even a matter of similar combinations. Most fighters try to go for all three.
That's what similar combinations are, basically. I mean, if you're
Wait, so similar combination means getting good at the sport. In this context, if you get better at the sport, if your wrestling is shit, everything else is good. By improving your wrestling, you got better at the sport. Just getting better at the sport. I feel like this is a little contrived. I think a better understanding, a better analysis of UFC fighters might just be looking at statistics. Because like ostensibly I'm a data scientist. I like looking at things like their success rate in takedown defense. I will only say a person has good takedown defense if they successfully defended a lot of takedowns. Do you know who has the best takedown defense in all of the UFC? Yes.
John Jones?
No. Kamaru Usman. Only taken down once in the entire UFC.
Okay.
But we don't really talk about that. We say he's a great wrestler because he holds people down against the cage, but he has amazing takedown defense. Damian Maia was the only person who got one takedown against him. And Damian Maia is an amazing jiu-jitsu black belt, and he couldn't do shit with that takedown. Okay. Charles Oliveira got Michael Chandler's back, and he couldn't submit him. I feel like when applied to reality, a lot of this breaks down because you look, Daniel. Are you good at predicting fights?
Here's the thing. I think if you expand on the model, let's say you still keep the striker, wrestler, and BJJ triple variables, three variables, right? And then instead of just having a dummy variable, which is like yes or no for any of them, you instead have varying levels for each of them. And I think if you ran a model where you had outcome of the fight, like where it is, like in on the ground, standing, or takedowns, and you mapped it onto the fighters' levels of striking, wrestling, and BJJ, you'll probably find a pattern where in the fights where they have the most different levels of striking, wrestling, and BJJ, there will be a higher chance of predicting where the fight will end up, and and the place where the fight will end up will be predicted by the discipline in which they are most common in.
Yeah, but this model has to go beyond styles. It has to go to conditioning. It has to go to general strength.
Yeah, of course.
It has to.
Yeah.
So I feel
that's
like
just like a.
So that's the thing, right? We can never use this model to predict fights. Have you predicted fights reliably?
No one does.
No one does. Well, I mean, there's some who are pretty good.
Well, I mean, but I think you can predict where the fight happens pretty accurately. I think you can't really predict who wins that well, but
I mean, by this model, if you can predict where the fight happens, you can also predict who's going to win. Because if the fight stays standing up, the better striker wins. If the fight stays on the ground,
no,
the better
that means you
wins.
didn't understand my point, which is that the fight happens where there is the most common skill level, usually, or not usually, but like
the fight happens
all else equal. You have to understand the point that all else equal, ceteris paribus. That's how it works.
Okay, then
if ceteris paribus is implemented, then I think you can actually have a model that works like this. And I think when we're actually thinking about it, we do think in these terms, right?
I mean, look, it's hard to say because how do you quantify a lot of these things? Like quantifying wrestling, Justin Gaethje had next to no wrestling against Khabib.
Well, that's Khabib. Khabib's just like wrestling is like
but Justin Gaethje was literally an all-American wrestler. He was literally one of the best in the entire country. But his wrestling skill didn't translate as well to jiu-jitsu.
That actually applies here because Justin Gaethje is like a striker pretty much, right? He's a striker plus wrestler, right? Khabib's a wrestler and a submission specialist, basically, right?
Okay.
So when you put them two together, this model would say that the fight would be Justin Gaethje trying to prevent the takedown and Khabib trying to take him down, because those are the common points.
I feel like on like a single fight, you can apply this. Actually, I will take back the statement. I was a little inflammatory. You have convinced me a little. On a single fight, maybe even a single round or in a single exchange, this could apply. I don't see this applying in a broader set trend, even if you expand this model. Because Conor McGregor is an amazing striker. Yet, Khabib was the first person to knock him down. First knockdown that Conor ever had. Poirier later knocked him out. But first knockdown ever, Khabib against Conor. Did this by pretending to go for a single leg and then haymaker through the top. I think that this model doesn't predict. I think this is like in game theory, right? You could probably put it in better words than me. The moment you understand the other person's preferred strategy, you can change yours. So the fact is, if you're always guessing another person's strategy or your competition's strategy, none of this is applicable because you're not going to commit to anything.
That's not true, because you can still reach equilibrium in which your two strategies are different from each other or the same from each other. I mean, just because you know the other person's strategy, who you know that they know your strategy, and infinite regress, doesn't mean that no strategy works. There is an equilibrium sometimes. So like,
how often is it in MMA? How often?
I mean, okay, for example, if someone's trying to take you down because they're BJJ black belt and you're a white belt, but you're like a champion Muay Thai fighter, you're gonna want to prevent the takedown, right? And so, just because you know that he's gonna take you down doesn't mean you're gonna change your strategy. And just because he knows,
that entirely yes, I'm definitely gonna change my strategy.
Change your strategy as in, given that your strategy is to prevent the takedown.
Wait,
right?
I literally had a camp. I would not only change my learning how to stop the takedown. I changed my stance to go wider, more of a boxing stance, so it's easier for me to sprawl. I would then practice takedown defenses. I would then, on top of that, practice knees, intercepting knees with flying knees, in Jorge Masvidal style. I would completely change. This is why we have fight camps. We would completely change our game to apply for the situation we're going against.
Yeah.
I feel like this only works as like a post hoc base level introductory analysis. I don't think this provides a lot of value to anyone who's not a newbie. Maybe
correct, and this hopefully was helpful for you newbies.
Okay, understanding this. It is mean for me to be a little extra critical of this, but I think that for the most part, we can't predict the future. I think that's what I love about fighting, is that you kind of have to keep the nerd shit away because the nerds are never right.
I have to counter on something you said about the game theory, because it's actually very incorrect for you to say this, which is that you sort of made the argument that if you can predict the other person, then they can, because the other person knows that you're predicting what they're going to do, there's sort of like this infinite regress, right? Where you're predicting what they're going to do and they're predicting what you're going to do, and you're going to predict what
I don't think it's infinite regress, but I think that constantly trying to figure out or outplay the opponent is going to create a lot of unknown variables, a lot of randomness into the mix. You're not going to do the same things that you do always.
I agree, but
I was a little hyperbolic on that statement. Yes, I agree.
You can definitely, I think in a lot of fights, you can pretty much predict what their game plan is going to be. Like, what do you think the game plan of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Burns is going to be?
Oh, it's going to be Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is going to try to kick him in the head.
Yes, but mainly he's going to try to prevent the takedown because he's a superior striker. And Gilbert Burns is obviously a superior grappler.
Maybe? I don't know. Yeah, I honestly don't know. When I looked at the Brian Ortega versus Korean Zombie fight, I for sure thought, okay, Ortega's not going to have the best hands. He might try to pull guard or do a weird takedown and try to get KZ to the ground. KZ's just going to get out of the guard because he's a good grappler and then beat the shit out of him. What ended up happening is Ortega breezed through him on the stand-up, and then on top of that, He was putting pressure, takedowns, tiring KZ, putting him, like, exhausting him. And I just didn't expect that. And I feel like for most fights, people can radically change their game plan. And sometimes they do. Even the most Habib is the most predictable fighter, right? Let's say he's the most predictable fighter. He will he will push you behind the two black bars next to the fence, and then he will go for a single leg, head on the outside. I don't know how he does that. Head on the outside. He's then going to try to push you against the cage, take you down by changing levels, and then he's going to wrap your feet in a leg triangle, and then he's going to get you to the ground. He's either going to get you to expose your back or beat the shit out of you. That's what he's always done. That's he got every submission that he had was from that type of position.
Okay.
But he's so good at giving people that because he uses his striking to be very unpredictable. His head movement is super unpredictable. His striking is very unpredictable. He gives people no option to be in the middle, so he pushes them to the edge, and the edge, there's only one way to go.
Okay. So what's your point?
So I think that even in the most predictable scenarios, there's too much uncertainty. That when you're trying to apply this game theory and trying to predict your opponent's strategy, I mean, you could hit equilibrium. I just think that's very rare.
I think equilibrium is what happens in most fights.
Do you have a lot of data on this? Because look, here's the thing, right? I'm talking out of my ass. If you have data on this, hard data, you did like an analysis in an SQL program, put in all of this and showed, you gave different attributes to these guys, you gave a good scale, a good methodology, and you said, okay, this model has such a high % validity, fuck you, I'll take that. I just feel like because I feel like all we were doing is arguing examples. I don't know how accurate this is, and we don't know how to measure it. So, you know what, Daniel? I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this is true. I just don't think you have the data to support it.
Well, I don't think it's like true to a very significant degree either. I mean, obviously fighting is a crazy sport and anything can happen and things are unpredictable. But I think this is just the underlying logic behind how people form their game plans. And that's sort of what I was trying to explain. I wasn't necessarily, I think maybe I wrote too hyperbolically here as well, like reliably. No,
Yeah,
not reliably.
I would take issue with that.
Yeah, like you can kind of predict, you can mediumly predict. I think if I were to rewrite that, but I think when we're analyzing fights and we're trying to figure out like who's gonna win, like what's gonna happen, this is sort of the logic that we use, which is that the striker will try to defend and the grappler will try to take down, and that's like generally, and like the different kinds of combinations. I think
it just boils down to you're going to try to put it in the position where you feel like you have the best advantage over your opponent.
Yeah, of course.
If it just boils down to that, I would agree with you. But I think what puts you in the best position is not whether you're a striker or a wrestler or a BJJ guy. I think that calculation is irrelevant to the discussion of put yourself in your best position.
Really? So you think?
Well, I'm okay. Irrelevant is too much. Too much. It's too much. I think it is not
secondary?
Very important. Barely tertiary. Barely quaternary. I don't think it's very. I need to look at data for this before I make any other hard conclusions. But I don't think this is me opinions, feelings. These are my feelings. They're not as powerful as your facts or facts that if you had, I would believe. But I don't think this is very reliable. I think this is a very reductionist way of looking at fighters and their game. I think it's too reductionist to be valuable. That is me. The statement that fighters will look for the place where they have the best advantage, the position with the best advantage, that is like almost tautologically true.
Yeah, it is.
I would agree with you on that. I just don't think this is how we come to. I don't think this is how we decide what the best position is. I'll be willing to listen to data. I'll change my mind if there's a lot of strong data on this. I just don't think that there is.
Okay, that's fair.